is a program that I give to a variety of audiences, and it basically is to help introduce people to climate change here in Connecticut, but also the global and local actions that we can take that can possibly help with the impacts that we are seeing from climate change. So just to start off, I'm Sue Quincy, and I'm located at the Kellogg Environmental Center down in Derby, Connecticut. So this is the great part about doing these virtual meetings and presentations, that, you know, it's ease of travel, no parking, and you don't have to go out into the weather. But it's very limiting sometimes in that you don't always get the same impacts. And we're lucky enough to have this program in that it uses a lot of online aspects for people to engage with the topic of climate change. And when we're looking at climate change, this material that we're going to be utilizing was developed by MIT out of Boston through what is known as the Climate Interactive, and their own organization and nonprofit that is focused on bringing understanding to climate change, and then tools that allow the public to engage with that. So right here is basically what we're going to be working with in a few minutes. I'm going to ask you to put in ideas as to what we can do on a global level that would mitigate our problem with carbon dioxide and carbon buildup in the atmosphere. Because this simulator that I'll introduce you to looks at the different areas that we can address climate change from what impacts the climate. And that's looking at our carbon levels. So on the right-hand side, we have our temperature change. This is what's anticipated and projected if we stay business as usual with the amount of materials that we are producing into the atmosphere in 2001. And the projection is we'll see a 4-degree increase in Celsius, which is 7.4 degrees Fahrenheit, increased temperature on a global perspective. Okay, and what is causing that is over here is what we're using on the left-hand side as our primary sources of energy. Because the most impact that we have in producing carbon and carbon emissions is from the transportation and the energy production ends of activity. There's also agriculture, there's forestry, there's residential, and industrial uses or home uses. But for the most part, we're looking at transportation, which is in this sector, buildings and industry, and the source of energy supplies. So all of these things will be considered, and we can change and modify our actions to see what is that impact going to do in bringing down our goal. And this is our goal here, is the bottom line. We want to bring it to 1.5 degrees of increased temperature Celsius, as opposed to our ultimate goal is the 1.5, but we definitely want to shoot for under 2 degrees increase by 2001. So we want to bring, instead of up to here at the 4.1, we want it down here or lower than 2 degrees. So let's get back to the basics and make sure we have an understanding of what we're looking at. In the bottom line, the rampant use of carbon dioxide that's being emitted into our atmosphere builds up in our atmosphere and layers up like a very thick blanket. And as we add more and more carbon into the atmosphere, it makes the blanket bigger. And that allows for heating of the surface. So that's where the reference of global warming comes from, is the fact overall climate is rising in temperature. That doesn't mean we aren't going to have cold. We're definitely going to have cold. It's just going to be a warmer sense of cold. So you can have, instead of 32 degrees, you have 35 degrees as annual averages. So that's what we're looking at in the science, is how does that carbon dioxide get into the atmosphere, and what has been the change that has increased the spike of carbon dioxide? And what's at stake is how the natural processes are going to be affected here on the planet, down at the ground level. And here we have a picture of a glacier as it's meeting water source. And as glaciers melt, it adds more and more water to the system, and that causes a domino effect of other activities. So that's basically what we're going to be looking at, is carbon dioxide and carbon emissions, along with other greenhouse gases, and how is that affecting us down here on the planet? Overall, when we've all seen these types of graphs and we've seen the historical information, but here gives a reference, is how temperature has been, or not temperature, but how carbon dioxide levels have been altering throughout history. So we can go back 800,000 years ago, and we have found the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we can trace that as we go through time. And in general, it's been under 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide for hundreds of thousands of years. And then when we get around the 1800s, the turn of the century, it starts to climb. Significantly, it starts to climb in the 1950 region, and it has really spiked since from the 50s to today. So we have to ask ourselves, if we know carbon levels have increased along this time, how does that compare with effects down on Earth? And so you start to take another set of data sets, and that's the average temperature. So the annual temperature, as it's averaged out over decades and placed onto the line here, we can see that as long as we've been having the carbon dioxide going up, we also see a rise in temperature. So that we can now connect the two, that carbon and carbon levels have altered and affected temperature because the carbon traps heat, doesn't allow it to reflect out into the atmosphere, and reflects it rather back down to the ground levels. So it's increasing our atmospheric temperature, and that's causing reactions down here on the planet. So when we're looking at those carbon emissions from the 1800s to today, we can break them down into their sources. So back here, if we're looking on our graph, 1800s, the primary carbon emissions were generated by coal use and by land use, which is wood burning, materials, opening of land, clearing of land, but primarily wood products. And then as we go through time, with the discovery of different types of energy sources, the 1900s, we got coal, but oil started to become more prevalent, and it was discovered, and we started to mechanize and use that energy source until you go through up here to the 50s, and we start to see an increase in not only coal and oil, but now we see more methane gases because we have larger sources of industrialization and agricultural practices. We also see that land use is starting to possibly come down a little bit, but we still have that emission that is coming out from land use and land clearing, the changes on our topography. And we have generated a new category, which is the others category, and that's generally from the production of concrete. In the process, it causes a lot of carbon dioxide and calcification outflow, and that changes and adds to our atmosphere as well as the other part of this little gray area here is from what is known as gas flaring, and that's the burning off of toxic materials in the process of extracting oil and natural gas from underground. And if you broke it down, these are some of the other materials that are coming off that are also greenhouse gases, adding to that heat trapping blanket. And that would be methane, which is this light blue. And we have the nitrous oxides, the fluorine gases. This is carbon related to land use, the forest and land use areas. And then still primarily, it's carbon dioxide that is generated and associated with the industrial processes and fossil fuel use. So that's the coal, the oil, and natural gas areas as well. So this is bringing us back to our business as usual. As we've been doing more and more in our environment, utilizing more of these resources and primarily burning fossil fuels, we have seen that the temperature has gone up. So using business as usual and what was going on beforehand, we can definitely make a projection into 2100. And that's now on the minds of a lot of people and policymakers, is how do we fall into areas and start to mitigate some of these problems so that we don't have the increased temperatures, which will only increase changes here on our planet. Because what are we seeing right now when we're back here at 2020 and we're at this level would only be magnified by the time we get to 2100. So looking in terms of worldwide, a lot of people have heard these areas of impact, such as sea level rise, increased frequency of drought, increased flooding, which seems very strange that you can have the two problems occur at the same time. And floods and droughts are something that we see here in Connecticut, and we'll have a change in how they show up. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But these are our changes that we know overall we are going to be getting different activities bringing on from weather, from natural processes such as tides and things, and storm fluctuations. So if we look at our coastline, we have to see, well, what do we have that's going to be impacted? And this is New Orleans, lovely coastal town and coastal area. This is from a resource that anybody can access called Climate Central. You can go in and you can put any coastal location and see what the impact of unchecked carbon use would result in. So here's what it would look like as of today. And then if we have unchecked, if we don't monitor and bring down our carbon outputs, this is how much area of that coastline is going to be flooded. And you've got a large land base, so you have a lot of infrastructure, residential areas, agricultural, and business sectors that are going to be impacted. So if we take a look here at New York, New Jersey, we know that we have a coastline up here. It too is going to happen to have flooding and more problems of water intrusion if we don't look at our carbon changes. So this is the potential of, if we don't do anything, we just let it run as we are always letting it run, business as usual, you see heavy flooding in the area of New Jersey, and you see inland areas and coastal areas of New York being heavily affected. And a lot of that is, in the New York section, is going to be impacting transportation sectors such as subways, railroads, and shipping. So those are some things we have to think about. So when we think in terms of Connecticut, we want to know, well, what's happening here? So this is what you can do in Connecticut terms. You can go to what is called surging seas, and you can also put in Connecticut area. I put in to that the projector, Madison, Connecticut. So we have the area from Madison all the way down through New Haven that was projected for flooding. If we don't do any change to our current actions and we allow business as usual to continue, the map on the left is the projected flooding areas that will be affected by 2100. So we have quite a bit of downtown New Haven affected, right up into the tidal areas of a lot of our rivers. If we do carbon changes that are projected for our activity and our planning, just cutting back, we still will have some flooding, but much, much less. And part of that is because we already have a large amount of carbon in the air. So we're going to have a time period where you're going to see continued reaction and shifting. And what we want to do is try and break down some of that impact. Currently, here in Connecticut, these areas are being impacted on a climate level. We've all heard about the lobster industry, and that the lobster industry, due to warming in the Long Island Sound, has changed the oxygen levels. Lobster are very sensitive and need high oxygenation, and so with the higher water temperature comes the inability of water to hold oxygen. And so these animals have actually left the area as a agricultural product, as a marine fisheries area, and you can still get them up north closer into Maine because the water is still colder there. But in our area, lobster is no longer considered a fishery industry that is going to be maintained in the Connecticut, Long Island Sound area. So we've changed some of our business practices, and we've impacted lobster populations. They still live there. You can still find lobster, but not in masses, and certainly not enough to allow us to take those numbers and use them for our own needs. Further inland, same water temperatures have increased, and so we can see that we have warming trends oxygen depletion comes with warmer trends, and our fishing is going to be affected and fish populations. So in the trout areas, we have rainbow, brook, and brown trouts that have all been stocked. And we know that our brook trout is our native trout. And so that's a canary in the coal mine for us. We are looking at the native populations of brook trout. And the restocked and the native populations are having a challenge in order to repopulate. So constant restocking ensures the activity of fishing, but native fish are finding it harder and harder to maintain populations on their own because of that same warming in the water and the decrease of the water's ability to hold on to oxygen or gases into it. And then we look at our other wildlife, and we're seeing shifting in bird populations. We have the piping plover, which is a shoreline bird, along with the salt marsh sparrow. Salt marsh sparrow is at highest risk. Our piping plover is actually starting to see a very good population trend based on last year's nesting results. We had quite a few that were able to hatch and fledge before we had any coastal issues going on. So that, for the past year or two, has started to show some promise. But they've lost nesting habitat, so we have to be really diligent at protecting the spaces that they're found. Same with the salt marsh sparrow, that animal, due to the shoreline and the sea level rise that we've seen, we have higher surge lines, we have higher tide lines, and storm lines. And so they lose their nesting habitat and get flooded out quite frequently. So that's the challenge, is we're starting to shift into and impact wildlife in ways that we hadn't planned on. It's not through direct development anymore, it's through our actions, and so the whole habitat structure is changing. We're seeing increased populations of pests like the mosquitoes and ticks, bringing new diseases. Our air quality index is at a risky area now that we have higher rates of heat and high heat index days, which cause poor breathing ability and poor air quality because of the different types of density of the air that's maintained from not just the heat itself, but also the humidity that comes with that. So the heat, humidity, all are reflective of that increased moisture that's in the natural process. And then we have our moose, which is succumbing to some of these animal diseases, such as brought on by winter tick. Their populations are having a hard time reproducing, and in New Hampshire, in the southern regions of New Hampshire, they're dropping in population quite significantly. One thing that has changed, and I think a lot of people have started to see some of that, is that typically what we're expected, our climate is what we expect, and weather is what you get. Weather changes on a day-to-day basis, and over periods of decades, we put these weather trends together, and we see that that climate that results from it, the temperatures that are expected, the humidity, the precipitation, have all changed. We are no longer getting cold winters, which is going to impact the natural process in which we can do things such as maple syruping, but also the natural process for plants, native plants, and trees in which they would be going dormant. And this adds possibility for more and more invasive species, because the warming trend means that we start to get an earlier spring and later falls, so that the temperature extends in a higher range. Remember, that's just 3 degrees increment that we have currently that Connecticut is experiencing, that can change whether or not we get snow or rain. If you haven't noticed, our precipitation is primarily rain. Especially in winter, we are not getting the feet of snow that we are typically supposed to get, but we still get snowstorms. They're quite large, they're very intense and strong, as opposed to being dispersed over the months where we have a few inches of snow added on with a few inches of snow. We tend to get a deluge all at once, and then infiltrated possibly with freezing rain or icing conditions, and then it stops. So that changing is altering what we call phenology, which is the timing of events. So plants and animals are timed for specific activities and reactions in the environment based on moisture and growth. And so when those timings, and we start to get warmer sooner, and then you get these sudden freezes that we still get, alters what is in bloom and what insects are out, and birds are coming back, and so their food structure changes. We also are seeing that obviously you're going to have a change in recreation, which is an economic change, because if we don't get snow, we aren't going to have the ski, snowmobiling, ice fishing industry as prevalent anymore, and you'll have to go further and further north to get those recreational opportunities. And we're seeing an impact on our shellfishing as well as other marine aquaculture aspects. So all of these things are scenarios in which we have impacts. And now we can talk about, well, what are some of the successes? It's not always going to be doom and gloom, that there are ways that we can address this very, very important topic, and we can make some changes as to how much carbon we're emitting. Now, I'm going to take a breath here for a second and see if there's any questions. So do we happen to have anything that has come up in discussion or in the chat box? Okay, so nobody has any questions, but I am going to ask you to participate at this point. So this is now where you're going to have to use your chat box, and you're going to put in some of your suggestions, because we're going to look at how that simulator is laid out. And this is where 10 minutes to save the planet comes into play here. Once we get into the simulator, I'm going to give 10 minutes, and we're going to make some changes. We're going to come up with some climate policy that is going to reduce impact of carbon emissions. So what we're going to do is we're going to address how we're going to put carbon dioxide into the air. And each one of these sectors can be moved, and we can adjust what we can do to meet these changing demands. So here we have transportation, so we can do energy efficiency, which looks at making vehicles better at utilizing gas per mile, or making electrification a possibility, in which we're going to go with electric cars, electric buses and trains. We can go with hybrid vehicles. You can look at buildings and industry. What if we went to highly efficient buildings here in Connecticut for energy efficiency? So the better windows and caulking and things like that. And then you can have other activities such as, what if we eat less meat? Is that going to have any impact? And that would be part of our land use decisions. All of that's going to be slid through our sliders here, and we can definitely get some of those impacts and see what's going to happen. So I'm going to change my screen share right now. And let me see if I can find it. The En-ROAD simulator. So let me see if we are seeing the En-ROAD simulator. Okay, I believe on your screen you can see the area. I'm going to put that terrible little gray screen back up, because that's the chat box, for a little bit, just to make sure if someone could tell me that yes, you can see the simulator. You can't see it yet. Oh, dear. Okay. Can you see it now? So I'm going to take my gray rectangle away. But, okay, can you unmute yourself and tell me if you can see it?
I can see it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you, I think there's only a few people online right now, as I think. So if you aren't going to put it in the chat box, you can just go ahead and give me a suggestion as to what we can do to address climate change through any of these actions. What are some of the things we could do?
Is it okay if we speak? Right?
Sure, you can speak. Let's do that. So
Okay.
we can unmute everybody and see.
Given that there's going to be quite a focus on job creation coming up,
Yeah.
I'm thinking maybe we could look at something like dealing with building efficiency, insulation, your windows, things like that.
So we can slide this slider, and if we go this direction, we're going to increase building efficiency. And when I move that, you can see what happens in our graph, because now it's going to react to, if we highly increase building efficiency in industry, we've brought our temperature projection down to 3.7 by that one move. And we've also changed this over here. I'm going to let you see this loop here so you can see it. Because the efficiency has gotten better, our energy demand is going to be reduced. And so our requesting of primary energy sources will go down in certain areas, and that's addressing the carbon. So we didn't quite make our goal through one action, but what else could we do? Go ahead and just shout it out.
Well, here's a question. What do you think people are most likely to tackle first as we try and bounce back from this pandemic?
Well, putting this in the is going to be very difficult because the simulator wasn't set up for that. But when we're looking at addressing the pandemic, the fact that we have shut down, we've addressed this area down here in our economic growth. So our status quo, which was before March, has gone down. So if we brought our economic growth down, we don't want to go high growth, to low growth. If you change how much economics you're putting into it and how fast you're driving product base, you bring down the temperature more because you're not using the energy resources because you've shut that down. If you slow growth, so if we maintain the low growth that we have at this point, whereas not all industries are going to be opening up, one big industry that's going to have a hard time opening up right away is the airline industry. And airlines are a big impact on carbon emissions. So at this point in time, we've had a really good reduction on carbon emissions for a couple of months. That's not going to change what's going to be projected for 2100 unless we maintain this for decades, and that's unrealistic. So that's one thing that we put into that. One other thing is that obviously, since we're home more, people are probably looking at energy efficiency. And so the efficiency of industries and buildings, people are doing a lot of home repair and upgrades. You can do a higher incentivization for industries to use more efficient energy resources in their mechanizations. So that can take place. If we're looking at transportation, we aren't doing driving. Our driving and commuting has dropped drastically. So maybe that's an activity with all this activity and focus on remote working, which is what we're all doing. Maybe that would make it easier for us to make those carbon choices. So those are things that would have to come up in discussion and in planning as to what is of value to keep for the purpose of carbon reduction. Right now, the decision is not a carbon issue, it's a public health issue. But we might prove that it's beneficial. So if we increase our energy efficiency here, where we make our cars less moving, obviously, but also more efficient, then we can bring down that temperature even more. Was there a question also that was typed in? I saw something flash across. Oh, okay. Well, there's a question that asks about inexpensive some aspects. And some of that could possibly be afforestation, which is planting trees. Another thing that we are at home, a lot of people are doing, but also other communities, we can start to think of how can we bring up our tree planting activity. And if we bring up all the way, we're going to plant to the highest point We've done some impact. Let's see what that was. It's 0.1 degree. And that's because tree space is limited in where we can actually plant and how many trees we can actually do. So besides planting trees, we have to stop taking trees away. And that also brings down a little bit. I saw that somebody had suggested eating less meat. That would be another land and industry use, and that's definitely be in our methane area here. So eating less meat is an activity that can definitely have an impact. So if we moderately reduce meat production, then we are reducing our methane gases. I'm going to show you something that happens here if we loop that. You see that the temperature goes down, but our energy doesn't. Our energy use doesn't go down. That's because we're impacting a different greenhouse gas, and that would be methane itself. So if we look at this type of a graph and we watch what happens, you see that light blue line shrinks drastically. Now, methane is a very disruptive carbon gas, carbon emission. However, carbon dioxide is still the largest amount emitted. So we have what's called a co-benefit from some of these. Not only are we reducing our temperature, we're actually reducing the destructive aspect of methane, which is something that's a long-term issue. So let's go back to our temperature. Oops, lost me. But we can see where our ultimate goal is. We're down to 2.7. We've still got to get underneath 2. So what are some of the things that we could do still that we haven't talked about? We didn't add electrification of transport. So if we incentivize buying hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles, we didn't alter the temperature there, but we did cause a big dip in the oil line. And that's because we're reducing our dependency on petroleum products. If we do more electrification for buildings, so if we start to take away from some of our oil furnaces and things like that, we go to natural gas or we go into electrification. Connecticut is not a big electric state. Again, haven't affected the temperature, but we have a co-benefit here. And I did see a comment of something was on renewable energy, and that's where you just kind of hit the nail on the head. We have not touched this sector at all. We have to look at the specific sources that we're using to generate our electricity. So let's say we are going to increase our renewable energy. So we're going to highly subsidize. We're going to try and get more people into solar. We're going to try and get into the trash to energy. We're trying to use more of our renewable energy resources like wind, solar, and geothermal. And now we can see our line here has gone up, and we have increased or decreased our temperature. So we've made a little progress there, but we're still generating the electricity. So it's not a big hardship in that we're reducing our dependency on oil and on natural gas. We're starting to use our renewables. It's getting cleaner, and we're going to have less carbon emissions. So that density of that blanket goes away. I also saw you just went here to the carbon price. And if we increase the amount of carbon, you see a very big change in our primary energy source, which goes along with that economic growth. Is how do we maintain economic growth? By putting a carbon price on that is fair. So let's do a little loop again on this one. We went from 2.5 to 2.1. That's a huge jump in carbon world. But look at your energy, primary energy sources, and you see a quicker dip. We start to react faster, which means we're going to have a better temperature outcome because it's going to be more costly for those higher dense carbon fuels like oil and coal. So those are going to dip down quickly. In fact, coal is going to show the fastest result. We start to see a big dip, and this is globally. This is not just in Connecticut. In 2024, globally, coal will dip down. Oil will have a slower decrease, and it kind of matches the renewables. So if we can bring the renewables up, we can then come off of the oil reserves a little bit. We can also look at bioenergy. Perhaps there's a better resource out there than the fossil fuels. We're going to subsidize the use of maybe algae or the sugar beets, things like that. So we're going to look for bioenergy sources. That's going to bring down this a little bit. We're almost to our 2-degree temperature. Who wants to make a last-ditch suggestion here? We can move any of these levers that we haven't touched. I'm going to give a second here. The new technology, that's a good one. We can definitely look into new technology, and that's where a lot of focus is. The thing is, we just don't know what that is. So we could have a breakthrough technology. Let's grab this little dot. And we made it to 2.1. If we have a breakthrough, we could also look at our natural gas versus coal versus oil. What if we tax oil? Starts to bring down just that line itself. So if we subsidize or go into nuclear power, still not that big of a change, but it's going to affect how quickly these go down. The other technology breakthrough that we could have, and this is one that really has to be met on a long-term basis, is carbon removal. The limitation of land space on the earth itself prevents trees being the only carbon sequester. And the limitations of what carbon can be absorbed in the ocean also prevents carbon sequestration by the ocean. We've maxed that out, and that's resulted in acidification of the seas, which is becoming problematic as well. So we have to have a technology that takes carbon from the atmosphere and puts it back into the ground. That is the biggest thing that's happened when we're looking at fossil fuel use. It's not just the fact that we're burning fuel. It's the fact we've taken a rock and we've put it into the atmosphere. And that's where the human impact has really highly visual, is that nothing else takes the magnitude of rock base and brings it to the surface, and not just brings it to the surface, but actually emits it into the air. So we have to have some way of taking all that, excess carbon and bringing some of it, putting it back into the ground. And that's where the technology is also being utilized in what's known as biochar, which is creation of carbon-based soil amendments, so that we can, it's a different type of charcoal creation to try and sequester some of that carbon out of atmosphere and inject it back into either rock or deep into soil base where it can be stored up again, as opposed to being in the atmosphere itself. So here you did it. You made your goal. We're underneath 2, which is great. And you have a goal, and it took a lot of work to get there. I got a question there. I'm going to have to open up, I think, the microphone, perhaps, if I can get those questions. But I'm going to go back to the program so that we can have some possible, let's see if we can, there we go. Make sure that you're seeing the program itself. There you go. Can you see that now? Back to our chart. So we've talked to all of those things, and now we've made a complete resurgence. We've reached our goal. So we're just going to take a little time, maybe not a whole minute, because that feels like an eternity here in silence, but just take a little time and reflect on what was that experience like as we're trying to reach that goal and how we got there. Okay, so if you're thinking about that, if there's anything anybody would like to share about how did it make you feel as we were working on it and when we actually made it to our goal of under 2? Go ahead and just type that into the chat and possibly share that. I'm going to bring up the chat box just to keep an eye on it. Okay, we have that education is important. That is definitely true. And part of that is the fact that we not only educate what needs to be done, we just understand also how we're going to have to apply those actions. And if you're looking at some of the ways in which we can get involved in it and what you can actually do, we have to see where you are as a person, and what you do in the private area is going to have a ripple effect. It's going to help spread word, but you can make personal choices and you can join groups that make these choices. And some of those choices you've identified. Okay? And you also need to know how you can possibly help others make those choices. So the question here is, Heidi was asking how much we can move those sliders in reality. Well, this is the wonderful part, is that simulator is what is used by policymakers. And so as each state in the U.S. and different countries are working on those actions, the 2 degrees goal was set by the Paris Accord. So that's why working within the Paris Accord, everyone knows what their goal is. They know all of those sectors. And so they're making their selections on it. And Connecticut has made their selections for a low carbon future as well. And you could go on to the DEP website. Let me see if I can share this screen with you. This one. And on the DEP website, we have what is known as the low carbon emissions. And I'm going to see if we can share that. And it's building a low carbon future. So I'm going to bring that up here. Where it sets out the plan, looking at those exact same, I got to do Connecticut, those same areas, looking at the impact that those areas have. Because we found some of those levers had a greater impact from moving things. So if you go into the climate change component, and I'm hoping, are you able to see the slide and you're seeing the DEP website? Okay. So you go into climate change for Connecticut Deep, down here to the low carbon future, and it shows you on the title page what the goals are. And our goals are set for 2050. So by 2030, we want a 45% greenhouse gas reduction. It identifies in this report how we're going to get there. Okay, what percentages of carbon from transportation, industry, agriculture, all of those different activities that we can take on a state policy basis. And it lays them out. And right now, the Governor's Council on Climate Change is looking at how to implement some of these changes so that it is not unfair to certain socioeconomic groups, more of a burden to try and reach, so that it can be done over the period of time. So by 2030, it's a check-in point. We want to have 45% of our goal. If we haven't reached 45% of the goal, we then have time to alter activities and focus on, well, what were those levers that made the biggest impact and how can we get those levers to move? Because what we just illustrated is when you're making your plans, it's not just one action. It's not a silver bullet. It's what's referred to as silver buckshot. So that it's all over and that coordination is being done by states reaching regional goals. And those regional goals then become part of more larger regions, such as country goals, and then zones, and then eventually you have the entire United States working on those regions. I saw a question, I think, Ray, you had a question about something with Ohio and Pennsylvania. Okay, could you possibly read that or tell me again? Otherwise, I'll have to put up that nasty little gray box.
No, sure. It's how do we deal with being downwind of Ohio and Pennsylvania? Right, and that is exactly right. That it's the Mid-Atlantic states are higher in use of coal. However, they are also decreasing their coal use. They are increasing, Ohio, Illinois, and other Mid-Atlantic states are increasing their nuclear power as well as their renewables. Pennsylvania is a large producer of wind energy, and we buy a lot of wind electricity from the Pennsylvania region. So even though, you know, they are known for that coal and they have a lot of emissions, coal and oil is very carbon dense, so there's going to be more carbon dioxide than if they're using lower emitting carbon fuel. They are making that switch. And some of what we saw in our simulator is that time lag, because you have to change over your machinery and you have to allow time for the carbon to cycle through, basically. So there's going to be 10 or 20 years before we see movement and decreases and improvements. And so that's why these goals are set up for us to do a check at 2030, 2050, 2075, keeping us on target so that on a global basis, we're only going to go up that 2 degrees. So it is states working together, and sometimes it doesn't sound like we're playing nice, but there are goals that are being met, and there are trade-offs. So they might not see that the coal part is the biggest step. They might be making more movement into methane reductions or transportation efficiencies and things like that. That's that scattered buckshot. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, do keep in mind that that simulator is available for anyone to use. So you can play with that at home. You can show it to your kids. You can show it to your neighbors, to other groups that you might be part of, because that's what the tool is. And the beauty of a tool is give somebody a tool in which they can see the impact, and you start to get understanding, and then everyone is able to come up with ideas and agreements. You can find that. It's very easy. Just Google En-ROADS is the name of it, or Climate Interactive. I'll go back to the PowerPoint and make sure you're seeing the PowerPoint slides itself, and we'll go backwards so that you can see. Oh, next question. But this is the name of the simulator. It's En-ROADS. So you can just Google En-ROADS or climateinteractive.org. Can't see it yet. Oh. Is it on now? Okay. So it's at the top of your screen, En-ROADS, climateinteractive.org. I also invite you to go to the DEEP climate change webpage and take a look at what that low carbon future plan looks like, and see where the high impact actions are and the lower impact actions, and then possibly see how they could fit into our potential here in Connecticut. but the simulator is free. It is based on the equations that the UN, NASA, and NOAA, they all utilize these same equations and these same simulator models. So it is a real world application that you have in your hands to see how climate change impacts can be addressed. Okay, if you have any questions, feel free. You can certainly email them in to the library, or you can email me at susan.quincy@ct.gov, and we'll be glad to try and answer them for you or give you some resources for some information. Okay, I thank you very much for attending tonight. Hopefully you can attend some other programs, and feel free to give us a call.
Thank you, Susan. That was very informative.
Thank you, Susan. That was very informative.